intensive, and extensive properties. Okay, so an intensive property does not depend on the amount of matter. So intensive does not depend on matter. Let me not. Okay. Well, remember, we already talked about matter. If I just go up, let's just look at our definition of matter once again. Let's see, where is it? It takes up space and has mass. So, coming back down to what we're doing right now, an intensive property does not depend on the amount of matter. So, an intensive... Well, alright, let's contrast this with an extensive property, which would depend on the amount of matter. So depend on the amount of matter. Okay. So again, now that we have this comparison, intensive does depend on the amount of matter, and extensive does not depend. Intensive does not depend on the amount of matter, whereas extensive depends on the amount of matter. So, what exactly would this be? So, depending on the matter, we're calculating mass, or we could be calculating volume, or we could be calculating length. I think that's, yeah, length. So any kind of these things, any of these kinds of things, maybe not length specifically, but just think about these two in particular, mass and volume. Those do heavily depend on the amount of matter, how much space. Remember how much space it takes up. Space and mass. Those are directly tied back to the amount of matter. So those are examples of extensive properties, whereas an intensive property would not depend on the amount of matter. So it could be something like luster, or it could be something like the melting point. Again, we talked about this a little bit earlier. Could be something like density. Actually, yeah, density, well, I'd argue, well, I'm not sure that's a very good example, but we could have color. That is definitely not an example of an extensive property. That is definitely an intensive property. It does not depend on the amount of matter. And then, I don't know, we could say boiling point, because that's boiling point. That's a good example. These are closely related. Again, nothing to worry about if you're not entirely sure what those two mean. We will get to them very shortly in future chapters.